I'm dirty, poor, and barely alive.
So was I once. Come inside.
She had not eaten for days. She had nowhere left to go, and she was about to collapse on a lonely western road. But when she knocked on a cowboy's door and said, "I am dirty, poor, and barely alive," his response shocked everyone. The wind moved slowly across the wide, empty plains and carried dust across the road like a restless spirit. The sun was low and red, and the land seemed tired, as if it had lived. Too many hard years on that lonely road walked a thin young man named Silas. His boots were torn, his clothes were little more than faded cloth hanging from his bones, and his face was covered with dust, sweat, and long days of hunger. He had walked for miles. Without knowing where the road would take him, he only knew that if he stopped walking, he might not rise again. His stomach ached with a deep, hollow pain, and his eyes had the distant look of someone who had seen too many doors closed in his life. Silas had once believed the world was a place where hard work would lead to warmth and belonging, but life had shown him a different truth, one where winter nights were colder than hope, and people turned away when they saw a man who looked like trouble. He had worked fields, carried water, chopped wood, and slept under broken roofs, yet every place he went something went wrong. Storms destroyed crops, owners cheated wages, or sickness took away what little he had saved. Until one day the road became the only thing left for him. The sky slowly darkened, and the long road curved toward a small wooden house standing alone beside a fence that had seen better years. A lantern burned faintly near the door, and a horse grazed quietly. Nearby, Silas stopped for a moment, his heart uncertain. Many times before he had knocked on doors, only to hear harsh voices telling him to leave. But hunger is stronger than fear, and weakness is stronger than pride. So he forced his tired legs forward, step by step, until he stood near the porch. Before he could raise his hand, the door opened, and an old cowboy stepped out. His name was Callum Drayton, a man with deep lines on his face and quiet eyes that had watched the world for many decades. His hat cast a shadow over his weathered features, and his long coat moved slightly in the evening wind. Callum looked at the young stranger for a long moment, seeing every detail: the dirt on his face, the trembling in his legs, the tired look in his eyes. That silent look said more than words ever could. Silas lowered his gaze and spoke with a weak voice. "I am dirty, poor, and barely alive." The words came slowly, as if each one cost him strength. Callum studied him carefully, and the silence between them stretched like the wide land behind them. Then the old cowboy nodded gently and answered, "So was I once come inside?" Those simple words were warm, like fire on a winter night, and for a moment Silas did not move because he could hardly believe them. Callum stepped aside, and the door opened wider, letting the light of the lantern spill across the porch. Inside the house, there was the smell of stew and wood smoke, and something else that Silas had not felt in a very long time: the feeling of safety. He stepped in slowly, as if afraid the moment might disappear. Callum placed another log in the fire and motioned for Silas to sit at the table. The young man lowered himself into the chair with shaking hands and watched as the old cowboy placed a bowl of hot stew before him. "Eat slowly," Callum said. "You look like the road has taken everything from you." Silas nodded and began to eat, each spoonful filling the emptiness inside him. The warmth spread through his body, and tears almost formed in his eyes, but he held them back. After a long, quiet moment, Callum sat across from him and looked into the fire, the flames reflected in his eyes, like memories waking from sleep. "Long ago," Callum said, "I walked that same road you walked tonight. I had nothing, not even hope. The world had pushed me down so many times I believed I belonged in the dust." Silas looked up surprised. The strong old cowboy before him did not seem like someone who had once been broken. Callum continued slowly. "One winter night, when the snow was thick and my strength was gone, I knocked on a door just like you did tonight, and old rancher opened it, and he said the same words. 'I told you so was I once. Come inside.'" The room was quiet, except for the fire crackling softly. "That night changed my life." Callum said, "The rancher gave me food and a bed, but more than that, he gave me a chance to stand again. He taught me How a man who has fallen can rise if someone believes he is still worth saving. Silas listened closely, feeling something inside him begin to stir a small, fragile spark of hope. Callum leaned forward and spoke firmly. The world will try to convince you that you are nothing but dust, but that is a lie. Every man standing strong today was once weak, hungry, or lost. The difference is someone opened a door. Outside, the wind continued to move across the plains, but inside the small house a quiet promise had begun to grow. That night, Silas slept under a roof. For the first time in many months, and as the fire slowly faded, he dreamed not of the long empty road, but of a morning where he might walk it with strength again. And somewhere deep in the silence, Callum watched the sleeping stranger and remembered the man who had once saved him, and he knew that the circle of kindness had begun again. Morning arrived slowly over the plains, and the sun rose like a quiet promise, spreading golden light across the land. Silas woke in a small bed beside the window. For a moment, he did not remember where he was, because comfort had become so unfamiliar to him. Then he smelled coffee and fresh bread, and heard the sound of boots moving across wooden floors. He sat up slowly, feeling warmth in his body. Where weakness had once lived, the night of rest had given him something he had nearly forgotten, strength. When he stepped into the kitchen, Callum was standing near the stove, pouring coffee into 2 cups. The old cowboy glanced at him and nodded as if he had expected him to wake at that exact moment. Morning comes early on this land. Callum said, "Sit down and eat." Silas obeyed quietly, and the 2 men shared breakfast while sunlight filled the room. After they finished, Callum stood and handed Silas a worn but sturdy pair of gloves outside. "The ranch is small, but it still needs work if you are willing." Silas looked at the gloves, then at the old cowboy and nodded. "Quickly, I will work harder than anyone you have seen." Callum gave a small smile. "We will see." The days that followed were not easy. The ranch had fences to repair, animals to feed, and land to clear. The work was long and demanding, yet with every sunrise, Silas grew stronger. His hands hardened, his back straightened, and his eyes slowly lost the empty look of a man without direction. Callum rarely spoke many words, but when he did, each one carried meaning. He taught Silas how to mend broken wood, how to guide horses across rough land, and how to read the sky for coming storms. But more important than the work were the quiet lessons hidden inside simple moments. One evening, as they watched the sunset from the hill, Callum said, "The world respects strength, but true strength is not only in the body, it is in the heart. A man must decide who he will become, even when the world tells him he is nothing." Silas listened carefully, because he knew those words came from years of hard living. Weeks turned into months, and the ranch slowly changed. Fences stood straight, fields grew clean, and the small house felt alive again. One afternoon, a traveler appeared on the distant road, walking slowly with tired steps. His clothes were torn, and dust covered his face, just as it once covered Silas. Silas watched the stranger carefully, because the sight stirred old memories inside him. He remembered the hunger, the fear, and the loneliness that had nearly taken his life. Callum stepped beside him and followed his gaze. "Looks like the road has sent another soul our way," the old cowboy said. Silas hesitated for a moment, remembering the night he had stood on that same porch with nothing left. The traveler reached the gate and stopped, his voice weak and uncertain. He said, "I'm dirty, poor, and barely alive." Silas felt the weight of those words, because they had once been his own. Callum looked at him quietly without speaking. For a brief moment, the wind moved across the land, and silence filled the air. Then Silas stepped forward, opened the gate, and said with calm strength, "So was I once come inside." The traveler looked at him with surprise and relief, almost collapsing with exhaustion. Callum watched the moment carefully, and a proud smile touched his weathered face. Inside the house, the fire was lit, and a bowl of stew waited on the table, just as it had on the night Silas arrived. As the traveler ate slowly, Silas realized something important. The kindness that had saved him had not ended. It had grown stronger by being passed forward. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the wide hills, Callum stood outside looking across the quiet plains. Silas joined him, and together they watched the long road stretching into the distance. "Do you know why that rancher helped me all those years ago?" Callum asked. Silas shook his head. "Because someone once helped him before. That kindness is like a trail across the land. If one man keeps walking it, the path never disappears." Silas nodded, understanding deeply. The road would always carry lost travelers, tired souls and broken hopes, but now there was a place where the door would open, where a fire would burn, and where a voice would say the words that could save a life. So as I once come inside, and on that quiet ranch beneath, the endless sky, the circle of mercy, continued moving from one generation to the next, like the wind across the plains, never stopping, never fading, and always finding another weary traveler who needed to hear that simple invitation to step out of the cold and into the light.